The big thing that I want to stress in this episode, that I want people to understand, is this. Going to the polls and voting is imperative. It's the most important thing you can do. But going to the polls and voting for the same people over and over again is insanity. If you expect the federal government to limit their power, it's never going to happen. They're never going to limit their own power. We as the state have to do this. Good evening and welcome back to the Constitutional Corner. I'm Craig McMichael, your host. I'm here with Mark Hogan.
Hello, everybody.
Today we're going to discuss the second part of guns. Last time we talked about the amendment itself, a lot into militia. Today we want to discuss some of the federal gun laws, the Supreme Court cases. But I really want to start us out with a quote that sticks to my heart. It's from Thomas Jefferson, and it's basically, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what will not and ever be.
Ignorant and free do not go together, do they?
They do not, Mark. You cannot be ignorant of the laws that you have, the rights that you were given at birth in this country, and still expect to be free. Because government's power. Government will consume and grow and consume and grow. And we talked about this in our other shows and other episodes. The rights that you have, they were given to you at birth. The founders talked about natural law, and these are rights that you had from the moment you were born, not something given to you by the Constitution.
Simply as a human being, basic rights.
Yeah. So let's kick off and let's go into some of these Supreme Court cases that we wrote down.
Some of the Supreme Court cases that have to do with the Second Amendment. The first one came along pretty late, that I can tell, 1876. This is 10 years past the Civil War, during the era of Reconstruction. And that case was U.S. versus Cruikshank. Pretty infamous case. Basically what they were arguing on the Second Amendment portion of this case was whether or not Cruikshank was guilty of depriving people of their right to vote and their right to bear arms, which he was exonerated on that. The next case was Presser versus Illinois, 1886. So another 10 years past that. They sustained Presser because the Second Amendment prevents states from prohibiting people from keeping and bearing arms, but may be subject to the state law as it has to do with militias. Okay?
That militia word again.
Yeah, the militia word again. And most of these early cases dealt with the militia and what's a militia and who's in a militia and you can't use that in a militia. And kind of evolved, that I've seen, to individual right to self-defense. So in 1939, this is 5 years past the National Firearms Act, which, as you know, prohibited the automatic weapon. The Tommy gun was very popular at this time, especially in Chicago and other gangland areas. Al Capone basically wrote the National Firearms Act by proxy because of all the attention that these gangsters were garnering and headlines, mowing people down with the Tommy guns. And so the National Firearms Act of 1934 addressed that and included automatic weapons, which is a machine gun, and sawed-off shotguns.
And I believe it put a $200 tax on the sale or transfer of a weapon.
I don't remember the figure, but that sounds about right.
Which is a lot of money back then, but it's interesting because the law hasn't modified that amount. I believe it's still $200 today.
Oh, really?
I believe. I could be wrong on that. Look it up if you want to get the actual number, but I think that's correct.
So the 1939 U.S. versus Miller addressed that basically Miller did not have a right to have that sawed-off shotgun. He actually transported between state lines, and he was in a lot of trouble. But they said, you don't have a right to have that sawed-off shotgun because it doesn't pertain to the militia aspect of being, well, how'd they put it, the effectiveness, the responsible relationship to the effectiveness of militia and protected by the Second Amendment. So he didn't have that. So He was found guilty on that.
That's where they were saying the sawed-off shotgun wouldn't be a weapon that was used in the militia, and so the citizen didn't have the right to carry that
It wasn't
weapon.
pertinent to the militia aspect of anything. So
The government always has good rules.
yeah, and if you don't like them now, you're going to hate them next time. So right. U.S. versus Haynes. We move up to 1968. Found that felons, Haynes, could not be compelled to self-incriminate. What he had done was, as a felon, he did not register his firearm under the, I believe he had a sawed-off shotgun as well, and
Okay.
he failed to register it. But what this case boiled down to was he was in trouble for that, but he was not required to self-incriminate himself by registering his illegally obtained firearm.
So his Fifth Amendment protection protected him from incriminating himself for illegally owning a weapon.
By filling out the paperwork to have the illegal weapon.
Okay.
So that was kind of a strange one. We move up into the 2000s with DC versus Heller. There's a landmark for you. That specifically spelled out in 2008 at the Supreme Court. Heller, as you know, was a police officer in DC.
That's correct.
And it was kind of a class action suit. Him and several other people, maybe 12, 15. It was a pretty small deal, but Heller was a DC cop who carried a firearm on his person all day during his job, but he could not have that very same firearm in his house for his own protection. DC versus Heller found for Heller et al. And he did have a right to have that weapon in his home for self-defense.
Yeah, and this is the first case in the Supreme Court where they actually rule that you have a personal right to own a firearm for self-defense in the home. They kind of left it in the home, and they still had, in the ruling, they still had verbiage that talks about, you know, certain weapons that you cannot have.
Right.
If you're, it would be a danger in certain areas you can't carry weapons, and we're going to discuss that as we go further. What's the next one?
Next one, McDonald versus Chicago, 2010.
Chicago's pretty safe, I hear. They have really good gun
Well,
laws.
that's the gun laws to keep everybody safe. You can leave your doors open to your car and your home all night long, and nobody ever gets hurt in Chicago.
You know, it's interesting. When you talk to a lot of people on the left, and I'm not trying to get into political politics here, but on the left, when you talk to people, they'll say the problem is people bring in guns from outside of Illinois.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
And that's where the issue is. And I always wonder if they're bringing them from across the border, because that seems to be the biggest funnel of guns inside the United States right now.
And that's really funny because the states around Chicago don't have that terrible problem that the city of Chicago has. So they're apparently just ordering all their guns in those surrounding states and transporting them straight to the city of Chicago.
Yeah, that's right. You don't see a high crime rate in the surrounding areas of Chicago. It's only really in the south side of the city. And it makes you wonder, is it the guns that are the problem, or is it the people using the guns that are the problem?
Exactly.
Or is it the people using the guns know that nobody has a gun legally, and so they do whatever they want?
Well, disarm the population and makes for easier prey. Is that not right?
These are all good questions that we should be asking ourselves.
Right. Ready for the next one?
Yeah.
The next one is my last one. That is 2022. That's recent, right? Like last month. New York State Rifle and Pistol versus Bruin.
Okay.
And you probably heard that in the news, fresh news from last month. Strikes down the overbearing proper cause law in New York. They had to show proper cause. Why do you need a weapon for self-defense? And nothing really seemed to meet the criteria. So effectively, we don't like your reason to have a weapon, so you can't have one.
Yeah, that's correct. And this was an interesting law when it was put into place. Basically what New York was saying was, you can have a gun, you just have to get approval from your overlords inside the state of New York. I don't read the Constitution where it says I need approval to do or exercise any of my rights. They're my rights given to me by birth.
When we think about these overlords, these people that run these cities and states, they're well protected behind gated communities with their armed security, and so you have a lot of conflict there.
Yeah, and so, you know, let's go back to the founders and let's talk about some of these laws, because Jefferson once told us, a free people claim their rights is derived from the laws of nature. the founders talked about the laws of nature constantly.
They're not provided by the government.
Yeah, yeah. And to end his quote, he said, "And it's not a gift of the chief magistrate." What Jefferson, in essence, is saying there is that you have your laws or your rights from birth. They're given to you by birth. The Constitution lists them out to help people understand your protections and your laws. But the government and the judges cannot take these laws from you or these rights from you.
Because they did not give them to you.
They did not give them to you. What does this mean? I could be wrong. I like to debate and argue this with people. I believe all federal gun laws are unconstitutional. And I know that's a out there statement. People say, "Oh, Craig, people are going to have tanks." Well, that's for the states to decide. But all federal gun laws, let's just start with this, are unconstitutional. And there's an interesting character, James Wilson. He was one of the first Supreme Court's justices. He was nominated by George Washington. And he had interesting quotes on this where he talked about the government has limited powers listed in enumeration, and the reverse is applied to the states. The 10th Amendment. In essence, what he is saying is that the states have supreme authority over the liberties and the rights of the people. The federal government was given a minute amount of authority listed in Article 1, Section 8, the 18 enumerations of the Constitution. And we've discussed some of that in the last few episodes.
Well, what do you say to people that say, well, if the federal government can't restrict your rights to firearms, how about the 1934 Firearms Act? No more machine guns, no more sawed-off shotguns. How does that apply?
That National Firearm Act is unconstitutional. The only reason it's been a law for so long is because we, the people, have allowed it. And there are some cases we're going to get into on this. And there's a way to fight back against this federal overreach as a people, as a society, and as a state. I want to branch off into politics a little bit. I find it interesting when the government does things. People are against it. I see on Facebook and social media and everywhere else, call your congressman, write your congressman, call your senator. People feel like they have, a few options. You can contact your elected representative. You can go to the polls and vote and try to make a change. Or you can try to get your state to do something. A lot of this, in my opinion, is Einstein's definition of insanity. Repeating the same thing over and over and expecting different consequences. I keep hearing all the time from people, this is the biggest election of our time. This next election, we're going to have this red wave or this blue wave. And it's
Every 2 years, you hear the same thing.
It's going to change everything, and nothing ever changes. The only thing that stays constant in this country is since the founding, the federal government has taken more of your rights and liberties from you. They have squashed you. It's like you're in a pressure cooker and you're just being cooked down into nothing. And the God-given liberties that you were born with are being stripped from your everyday life.
And they come with caveats and strings attached, and before you know it, you're just wound up in a ball.
You see this a lot. The government will pass a law and say, we want you to do X, Y, or Z at the state level, and then they attach some money to it, and the states just grab onto it because they want this money, and liberty be damned. It's
There's
like
a whole lot of carrot and stick going on. You better do this, or we're going to pull this from you, or we're going to give you this if you do this.
That's right.
From the government to the states.
And so James Madison actually in Federalist 46 talked about this. He talked about the ability to refuse to cooperate with the federal government. I believe our next episode is going to be on the General Welfare Clause, and we're going to go into how people misinterpret that next week. But for now, refuse to cooperate with the federal government. The states have the ability to do this. The Supreme Court has ruled on this numerous times, I think 5 times that I can remember. The anti-commandeering laws. The federal government does not have the power to tell the states they have to do something that isn't listed in the 18 enumerations of the Constitution. The states have the right to resist. One big law that I've seen with this with the Supreme Court is a case that was in 1997, Prince versus the United States.
That's a new one on me. Tell me about that.
So Prince versus the United States, after the Brady Act, where they required a federal gun registration, where you had to do a background check. Some of the sheriffs in local states claimed that it was unconstitutional and the federal government couldn't enforce them to collect this information on citizens before they bought a gun. It's a fascinating case because there were different courts involved. And so one of the cases went to the Ninth Circuit, which I believe is in California.
I believe so.
I believe it's the most overruled circuit. And This case is interesting to me because it should teach us as a people that judges can be partisan. Judges can be biased. Judges do not always follow the law, and just because they dictate something from behind their bench doesn't make it true. The Constitution is easy to read and it's easy to understand. Your laws and liberties are given to you at birth. Exercise them. The Ninth Circuit ruled against this. The Second Circuit ruled in favor, and since you had a split there, it had to go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed. The federal government didn't have the right to require the states to collect this information on individuals. Now, what's fascinating about this is while this was going through the court process, most sheriffs and counties and municipalities, and I think they're called political subdivisions inside of states, collected this information anyways. They just went along with it. Sometimes there are strings attached. And what I found from reading through these laws and researching the Constitution is you see a lot what happens with the government when they take freedom from you, when they suppress liberty. It's always under an emergency. The 34 Firearm Act. Oh, there's an emergency. The gangsters are killing everybody. Everybody's going to die. We have to pass this law to protect the people.
Who was it that said, never let a crisis go to waste? That's your opportunity to get things done.
I think a few people have said that, but the first time I remember it was in the Obama administration.
Yeah, I think it was his DA, his AG.
His Attorney General. That might have been him,
Yeah.
or it was somebody in the Obama admin. But they do this. They cause crisis. And through the crisis, they commit chaos, and they take liberty from the actual people of this country.
Well, it looks like they're creating the chaos, or they're pointing to chaos that's not really there, to get everybody stirred up so they can come in and save them from that chaos.
That's right. And you know, the one thing that I found interesting is some of the states have finally picked up on this idea of 10th Amendment nullification. It's interesting, and you know, we're in Texas. I don't know if people know that, but in the state of Texas, we always like to think of how conservative we are. You know, all the statewide offices are controlled by so-called conservative Republicans. We control the Senate and the House, but we do not have the leading way in a lot of these conservative ideas and thoughts. And that's something, if you're inside the state of Texas with me, that you should start asking your local representatives about. Where are they on these laws? What's the holdup? And so there's really kind of two standards that I've seen. I'll call them the gold and the silver standard for these laws. Let's start with the silver. The state of Arizona. I've been there. My son lives there, actually. It's very hot. I try not to go. You breathe, and it's just the air fills your lungs. And
Well, on the other side of that coin, I was stuck in Wilcox, Arizona, in the worst blizzard in 34 years.
Really?
Yeah, I was 6 years old.
So in Arizona, they pass a law that states, and it's been signed by the governor, that any past, present, or future federal gun laws will be null and void. And any state official is not allowed to assist the federal government with the enforcement of these laws.
Or they're fined, right?
They're not fined. That's Missouri.
Oh, okay.
We're going to get to that in a minute. So Arizona's a good start. They do the null and void. And they encourage people not to assist with the federal government. The standard for this is what we should all be pushing for, and this is going to play out in the courts in the next cycle with the Supreme Court, is the state of Missouri. Missouri passed a law that all past, present, and future federal gun laws are null and void, and any official of the state that assists the federal government in enforcing these laws in any way can be fined up to $50,000. Now, of course, the Obama administration, the Biden administration, I feel like Biden now, I forgot.
Well, this is
I forgot the
Obama
name.
Part 2.
Maybe I have dementia. So, you know, the Biden administration's suing, and we're going to see this play out in the Supreme Court, but if they hold true to the anti-commandeering laws, we're going to see that this Missouri law will stand. And why is this important? It doesn't mean that the federal government can't come into the state of Missouri and enforce federal laws. You can't stop a federal agent from coming into the state and enforcing these laws. Let's take the ATF. I don't work for the ATF. I don't know the exact numbers. I don't know what their budget is, but I know they have a little over 5,000 employees. I think it's like 5,500 or 5,600 or something like that. Around a third of those are administrative staff. They're not people actually enforcing the gun laws. So what they're going to find is they don't have the personnel to enforce their own federal gun laws. Generally, when the ATF gets involved, it's the local police department, a sheriff's department, maybe a county constable that does all the legwork, that busts through the door, that does the search warrant, that seizes the gun, that does most of the paperwork.
They've got a couple of agents, and they call in the muscle from the local authorities.
Yeah, and I want to mention at this point, because I love police officers. I think a lot of them work very hard and do a very good job, but a lot of the people that support the police officer unions, they have pushed back against a lot of these laws. And there are a few reasons for that. Montana has a law kind of like this. There's no penalty enforcement, and they don't do past, present. They only do future laws as of, I think it was July 21st of 2022. But what was interesting about the Montana law is they said any modification to a law, and this is important because you'll notice the federal government doesn't make new gun laws, they amend old gun laws. And so if they amend an old gun law, then Montana's law will take effect for the nullification. Also, another thing about, back to the police officers. So they're pushing back against this because they get federal money for enforcing these things. And a lot of times you'll find that local sheriff's departments or city police departments, they like to be able to have the option of tagging a federal gun crime onto somebody to get them to flip state's evidence or, give up somebody. It's just a game that people are playing with freedom.
A leverage thing.
And once you give a little bit of freedom, you give a lot. The other interesting thing about the Missouri law is it actually lists law-abiding citizen as somebody that's allowed to hold a gun or keep a gun. And they actually have a full list inside the law that states what that is. And what's fascinating about it is they say a law-abiding citizen to them is not somebody that's been charged with a federal crime. So you could be charged with a felony at the federal government level and still be allowed to hold a gun inside the state of Missouri under their law as a law-abiding citizen of their state. And the point of this was to make sure the federal government didn't start charging people with crimes to stop them from holding a gun. It's kind of like the big debate. They say people with a mental illness shouldn't have a gun. Mm-hmm. When I got out of the Marine Corps and I was done with my combat tours, a lot of people would say that I shouldn't have been able to own a gun because it was possible I had PTSD. And so...
Well, you have the elites coming up with a definition of what is a mental illness at that point.
That's correct. That's the danger that you have to watch for, is who decides who's mentally ill.
Well, they could say anybody who voted for Trump is definitely crazy, so you're out of the mix.
I work downtown Houston. I can tell you, driving downtown, I pass at least 1,000 mentally ill people every day from the way they drive. The roads are dangerous out there. So
yeah, and that goes the other way too. No matter what side of the fence you're on, you don't want to give that kind of power to somebody.
Yeah, you don't. And so, Texas has some laws that they're working on. I actually think from reading about it, there are about 11 states that are working on nullification laws. And here's the important thing that I was getting to is the federal government doesn't have the resources to enforce all the federal laws. But if just one state does it, they could shift resources to just that state to punish them. That's why it's important for us to stand up with our fellow brothers and sisters in other states and put these laws into place, because then the federal government can't enforce the laws on all of us. And really where the idea from this came from, a lot of people say, well, Craig, this sounds crazy. The idea from this came from, I believe it was Oregon and their sanctuary policy, where the federal government, they would not help the federal government enforce immigration laws.
Right.
And then we started seeing a big rise in this with the federal or the states passing cannabis laws. So cannabis is illegal at the federal level. I don't know the number. It might be 26 states now have said cannabis is legal. For those of you that don't know, I'm talking about marijuana or weed. But this is an example
Grass,
of this,
man.
Grass, man. This is an example of the states saying, you know what? You passed this federal law, but it's not in your enumerations to tell people in our state that they can't use cannabis. And so we're going to pass a law saying they can, and we're not going to enforce your federal laws. And the federal government has lost these lawsuits as they've gone through. They did it same with the immigration. And so this is what we need to do. We need
Sanctuary cities.
We need to jump on this with the guns and say, you know what? We're going to push this for guns. And let's not just stop at guns. Let's start talking about all the other freedoms the federal government's taken from us. And there are ways to do that. You have to get involved. The big thing that I want to stress in this episode, that I want people to understand, is this. Going to the polls and voting is imperative. It's the most important thing you can do. But going to the polls and voting for the same people over and over again is insanity. If you expect the federal government to limit their power, it's never going to happen. They're never going to limit their own power. We as the state have to do this.
We the people.
And I can tell you right now, I watch a lot of politics. I follow a lot of politicians. And you could tell me any name you want and say, well, this is a great politician. You know, he stood up for this. And I could show you 10 times he violated the Constitution and took your rights. There's not a single one. You should ask yourself, how come politicians never sit in front of you and say, I'm here to do what's right for the people. I'm here to do what's constitutionally right. And I'm in what's right for liberty, not what's right for my own power and my own political party.
Right. Goes back to that free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as a gift of the chief magistrate.
That's Jefferson had a lot of great saints. Jefferson, Madison, Alexander Hamilton, but he's an interesting one because he wrote some articles in the Federalist Papers that talked about the limiting of the government. And then once he got power, he proved that he liked government.
Right.
And we'll discuss some of that in our general welfare clause, because that's really where a lot of the government pulls their powers. They believe they have the right to do anything generally. But if you take anything from today's episode, just know all federal gun laws are unconstitutional. If you want to talk about state laws, we could have that debate. Do the states have the right to make gun laws? There's some historical precedents for that. I could argue the other way. For an example, a lot of states had religious requirements for political office. Up to 1853, I think, was the last state. That was Massachusetts. But we need to remember that the federal government is not our master. They're supposed to represent us. They're supposed to protect our liberties and our freedoms.
Right. There's been so much overreach, and little by little, chip. It doesn't happen all at once. Nobody would stand for it, but a little bit here and there. It's always for the children. It's always for the health of everybody. And more, the argument is, well, if you don't agree with me, then you're a bigot, or you hate the kids. You want to see grandma die. That is such a dishonest argument, and it's not even a debate. It's just an insult. I think people are seeing through that.
Well, that's one of the sad things I've noticed talking about the Constitution with people is a large section of our population can have a civil discussion about the difference of opinions. You might disagree with me. That's fine. Send us an email. It's at studio13media@gmail.com. Tell me your opinions. Tell me your thoughts. I would love to have a conversation about it, a polite, civil conversation about the differencing of an opinion.
Well, what's fun is to go YouTube is a good source for the old Meet the Press from the 70s and the 80s and the debates they had. It was all respectful, no name calling, and it was a debate on the points, and disagreement was fair enough.
Yeah, we're a country of 330 something million people. We're not all going to agree. And that's what the founders talked about when they wrote the Constitution, is they knew they couldn't even agree on everything. They debated for years about this stuff. Madison has notes that he took inside the debates about the different parts of what they were debating and what they meant.
Thank God for those. It's so great to look back on that and say, what are these guys really talking about?
Yeah, so there's no way today that each one of us is going to sit down and agree on everything. That's physically impossible. But we should all be able to agree on one thing. I want to be free. I want to wake up in the morning to be free. I don't want the government to take my rights from me. I don't want the government to oppress me. I don't want the government to limit my livelihood or force what I can or can't do. Now, I'm not talking about anarchy. There has to be a government. There has to be tranquility, and it talks about that in the preamble of the Constitution.
There has to be a legal system.
There has to be a legal system and tranquility. This is why we formed this union. We started this constitutional republic to make sure that we all had the ability to live the most free life possible under a system of protection that our government provided.
Pursuit of happiness.
Pursuit of happiness. Originally it was property, life, liberty, and property. They debated that for a long time, and they came back with pursuit of happiness, which I think they should have left property and added pursuit of happiness, because your happiness might be completely different than my happiness.
Well, it's the pursuit of happiness. It's not the guarantee of happiness.
That's right. In a free society, we don't guarantee you anything. I don't guarantee you a college degree. I don't guarantee you a good job. I guarantee you the ability, if you work hard, to achieve whatever your dreams are. And even then, you could fail.
Right.
Your dreams may never come true, but at least you had the option to strive for them.
The choice to strive for a better life for you and your family, and you fail and you learn from those kind of things, right?
Yeah.
Well, with that, I'd like to thank you for being here, and I'd like to thank you for being here. We're very grateful that you've joined us. Stay tuned for more goodies from Studio 13 and the Constitutional Corner. That's how we see it. What do you think?